Hi friends! Welcome or welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Bridget and I make home and DIY content every week here on YouTube. You can also follow me on Instagram at bybridgetdiy if you want more behind the scenes content as well as tips and tricks. I hope you love watching today's video as much as I loved making it for you. And if you do, you can hit that subscribe button and ring the bell to make sure you never miss one of my videos. Let's jump in. I'm always looking for creative ways to style plants in my home while keeping them out of reach of my two very curious cats. So in today's video, I'll be showing you the basics of macrame by making 3 plant hangers. I've got something for everyone, whether you're completely new to macrame or on the experienced side. For each of today's plant hangers, I'll demonstrate variations of basic knots as well as 3 unique ways to add pops of color. Let's get started with the first one. For plant hangers, I typically like to start out with 4 strands of macrame cord folded in half. Each strand is 3 times the length of my arms when they're spread wide, or 3 wingspans, if that makes more sense to you. I'm taping them down at the center point before starting my first knot. I begin by taking the rightmost strand and making a backwards 4 with it. Then I bring the leftmost strand over the top of that one, around the back of the center 2, and up through the gap in the number 4. After I've pulled that tight, I'm doing the same thing in reverse, taking the leftmost strand and making a regular 4, bringing the rightmost strand over top of it, behind the center strands, and up through the gap in the 4. I repeat this process alternating between these 2 knots to create a column of square knots. When I've got about 8 knots total, I'm rotating the strands 180 degrees and tying 3 more sets of knots. Now that I have about 2 inches of knotted macrame, I'm removing the tape and folding the macrame in half. This will be the loop I hang from a cup hook later. To join the 8 strands together, I'm taking the back left strand and the front right strand and using them to tie 1 more square knot around the other 6 strands. With the macrame hanging from the loop we just made, I'm dividing the strands into 2 groups of 4. About 6 inches below the loop, I'm going to tie another backwards 4 knot, but this time, instead of following it with a regular 4 knot, I'm going to keep repeating the same backwards 4 knot, creating a spiral shape in the macrame. When I reach my desired spiral length, I'm going to flip the macrame and repeat this with the other 4 strands. Next, I'm taking half the strands from each spiral section and lining them up so that I can make several flat square knots using the same method I used to tie the hanger loop at the top. After about an inch or 2, I'm repeating this step with the other 4 strands. About 8 inches further down, I'm taking 1 outer strand from each of the 2 clusters and tying a traditional square knot using right over left, then left over right. I did this twice before moving on to the next 2 strands and repeating until I had 4 clusters of 2 strands each. When you have the 4 clusters, take 1 strand from each of 2 neighboring clusters and, while holding the strands together as one, tie 2 regular knots, one above the other. Repeat this step until you have 4 new clusters of 2 strands each. When you've finished this step, you should have a net-like structure as seen here. Now I'm taking my planter pot and placing it inside the net, adjusting it until I like the way it sits. Without letting go of the strands, I'm removing the pot and setting it aside. I'm tying all 8 strands together using the backwards 4 spiral knot from earlier. Next, I'm trimming the strands to create a tassel. The final step in this hanger is to add some color. First, I'm pouring hot water into a plastic bucket and adding in about a 1/4 cup of salt. Next, I'm adding the bottom third or so of my hanger into the water and making sure it's fully saturated. This will help the dye absorb in the following step. Into the hot water mixture, I'm adding about a 1/2 teaspoon of black Rit Dye and mixing it in. After allowing it to soak for about 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to pull several inches of the dyed hanger out of the water before adding more dye and letting it sit for another 10 minutes or so. Repeat this process until you have dyed the entire tassel. Remove the hanger from the water and use a paper towel to squeeze out some of the excess water, starting at the lighter end and moving towards the darker end. You'll notice that we've created a lovely ombre effect. When the tassel has dried, you can add your favorite plant back in and enjoy your handmade ombre plant hanger. There are so many beautiful dye colors you could use for this project, so have fun with it and personalize the color to fit your space. Our next macrame plant hanger starts with the same square knot loop method as the first one. After that, I'm taking about a 3-foot long piece of black yarn and tying it securely in a square knot around all 8 strands of macrame. Next, I'm winding the yarn around the strands until I've covered about an inch or so. Then I'm threading the yarn onto a plastic sewing needle and feeding that under several strands of the wrapped yarn. I repeat this step, but before pulling the yarn all the way through, I'm winding the needle around the loop to create a knot. I'm wrapping a few more times and then pulling the yarn tail under one last time before trimming off the excess. Next, using the same method as I did with the black yarn, I'm creating another stripe of color using this lovely bronze shade. I'm moving down several feet and repeating the same process, but this time combining the black and bronze yarns to create a variegated section of color. I wanted this tassel to be a bit fluffier, so I'm separating each macrame cord into its 3 individual strands. I love the volume and wavy texture it creates. This has to be the simplest plant hanger I've ever made. It requires minimal knots and it can easily accommodate any size planter pot. For the third and final plant hanger, I'm using macrame cord and a metal ring that came in a kit. I don't like this cord quite as much as my usual kind, but I didn't want to waste, so I decided to use it. I'll link my favorite cord below in the description. To secure the cords to the metal ring, I'm tying 2 pairs of square knots around the middle 6 strands. Then I'm moving down about 10 inches and holding 2 neighboring strands together to tie a regular knot. I repeated this all the way around to get 4 knots total. Another 6 or so inches below that, I'm tying 4 more knots, 1 per 2-strand cluster. Here's what it should look like at the end of this step. About 4 inches further down, I'm taking 1 strand from 2 neighboring clusters and tying them together in the same way as before, repeating this all the way around. You should recognize this net structure from the first hanger we made. This time, I'm using a much smaller planter pot as a reference to decide where to tie my next row of knots. As in the previous step, I'm tying knots using 1 strand from each of 2 neighboring clusters. Once again, I'm placing the planter pot in the hanger and holding the strands tightly with one hand so I can use that as a reference point to tie them all together. I decided to go with the flat square knot method to create the top of this hanger's tassel. Then, I'm trimming off the ends of the 2 knotted strands. This is where things get a bit more interesting. First, I'm warming up some Sculpey air dry clay in my palms to make it more malleable. Then, I'm pinching off a small piece of it and flattening it a bit so that I can wrap it around the knot in my macrame. I decided to use clay instead of beads because I was going for a bumpy, imperfect shape. I'm repeating this process around all 4 knots, as well as the 4 below them. When the knots are all wrapped, I'm taking a bit of rubbing alcohol and using it on my finger to smooth out some of the cracks and folds in the clay. After the rubbing alcohol is dried, I'm painting the top row of balls with Terracotta Paint in the shade Mesa Pink. For the next row, I'm using the shade Pueblo in the same paint brand. This one dries like a true terracotta shade. Just to make sure the colors were even, I'm giving all 8 clay balls a second coat of paint. Of all today's projects, I think this one is my favorite. I loved mixing the different mediums and colors to create something that ties together several elements of my home. I love how the terracotta finish of the paint maintained the clay's natural texture while adding pops of color. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. I really enjoyed making these projects, especially with something as versatile and inexpensive as macrame cord. Honestly, I feel like we barely scratched the surface today, so let me know in the comments down below if you'd like me to do another macrame video. I'm already brainstorming more creative ideas for ways to incorporate macrame throughout my own home that I'd love to share with you. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and stay tuned for future content by hitting the subscribe button and ringing the bell. See you next time!